If you've been following the shifts in global politics, global trade, you've probably heard some familiar talk lately. A certain tough stance demands for fairness. But what if the main target this time isn't who you might first think? Today, we're actually zeroing in on India. Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to help you cut through the noise on these really complex global issues. And today, we're diving into a pretty fascinating and honestly quite tense situation. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's renewed trade threats aimed at India. This isn't just about tariffs and trade deficits, though. It's way more layered than that. It touches on geopolitical strategy, economic ties, the future of global alliances. So our mission here is pretty straightforward. We want to really unpack this challenge in U.S.-India relations for you, layer by layer. We'll dig into the why these threats keep coming up. We'll look at the history behind them, why India is so strategically important, maybe more than many realize. And then, we'll weigh the potential consequences for both the U.S. and India and, well, for global geopolitics generally. The goal is simple.
For you to walk away really understanding this critical dynamic, to be well-informed. Okay, so let's unpack this. Now, when you hear these remarks, it's easy to just think, oh, that's just campaign talk.
Right, standard political rhetoric.
Exactly. But if you look a bit closer, you see they really signal a consistent push for protectionist policies. And if an administration with that view returns to power, well, these policies could seriously reshape global trade. Big time.
It really is striking, isn't it, how India consistently seems to be in the sights of this particular protectionist vision. And like you said, this isn't some new idea cooked up on the campaign trail. It's really a revival, a continuation of a strategy we saw play out before. It suggests it's, well, less about a fleeting promise and more about a pretty deep-seated economic philosophy.
That's a key point, the consistency. When we talk about Trump's stance on India, it's not a sudden detour. It feels very much like an echo of his first term, a return of those tough trade tactics.
Indeed. That's the core thing to grasp. With Trump prominent in the political discussion again, those characteristic trade tactics are back too. And India, well, India has been a consistent focus. It's not a fresh development. It's a continuation, almost a predictable revival, you could say, of that pattern we saw established earlier. It seems rooted in his economic worldview, one that really prioritizes what he defines as fair trade and the method, often aggressively confronting trade imbalances, sometimes with unilateral actions. This view seems to treat trade less like a mutually beneficial exchange and more like a zero-sum game, where one country's gain is seen as another's loss.
Right, so intervention is needed to sort of rebalance things in that view.
Yeah, exactly. Assertive intervention.
So moving beyond the rhetoric, how did this actually play out during his first term, specifically with India? What were the real tangible impacts?
Well, during the first term, the biggest concrete consequence for India was definitely losing its special trade status under the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences.
GSP, right? Maybe quickly explain what that actually is for anyone unfamiliar.
Sure. GSP is a U.S. program, been around since the 70s, actually. It was set up to help developing countries boost their economies. How? By letting thousands of their products enter the U.S. market completely duty-free, no tariffs. The whole idea was to give these countries a bit of a competitive edge, help them integrate into the global economy.
And India had been part of this for a long time.
Since the very beginning, yeah. So it was a substantial benefit for Indian exporters. Losing that status back in June 2019, that was a serious blow. It meant, basically overnight, Indian exporters had to start paying U.S. duties on billions of dollars worth of goods.
Billions. Wow. What kind of goods are we talking about?
Oh, a whole range. Textiles, engineering goods, chemicals, some agricultural products. A lot of different sectors were hit. For Indian businesses, it just meant higher costs, straight up. Made their products less competitive in the U.S. market, often more expensive for American buyers, too.
So not just a minor tweak, then. A real economic hit.
Definitely not minor. It had ripple effects through supply chains, impacted profit margins, it forced adjustments.
And there was that very direct quote back in 2019, wasn't there? About India taking advantage. How did that frame the decision?
Yes, that quote was quite blunt, really laid out the administration's thinking. It was, India has been taking advantage of the United States for many years. That's not going to happen anymore.
Pretty unambiguous.
Very. It clearly framed the GSP withdrawal not just as, a policy shift, but as correcting a perceived imbalance, an unfair relationship, in their view. It sent a strong message. The U.S. was ready to use its economic leverage to get what it saw as fairer terms, even if it meant disrupting longstanding agreements like GSP.
And that rhetoric was probably key for building support at home for that kind of move.
Absolutely. It played into a narrative about protecting American interests.
Okay, so GSP was the big headline action.
But what were the other, maybe deeper or ongoing complaints? The grievances that kept fueling this tough stance on India?
Right. Beyond GSP, there were these recurring themes. The underlying grievances have been remarkably consistent, actually. First and foremost, there's the U.S. trade deficit with India, always a focus.
Meaning the U.S. imports more from India than it exports to India.
Exactly. And for those pushing protectionist policies, a trade deficit is often painted as, well, a sign of weakness. Lost jobs, foreign countries benefiting too much, that kind of thing. It becomes a major flashpoint.
A signal that something needs fixing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But beyond that overall deficit number, there were very specific complaints about India's own tariffs on American products.
Okay. Like what?
Well, a classic example, often cited, was motorcycles. Iconic American brands like Harley-Davidson faced really high import duties in India, sometimes up to 100%.
100%? Wow.
Yeah. Effectively making them luxury goods way out of reach for most Indians. That was always held up as Exhibit A of unfair market access.
So pricing U.S. goods out.
That was the argument. Similar complaints about tech goods, too, tariffs and other barriers, making it hard for U.S. tech companies, software and hardware, to compete fairly in the large Indian market.
And agriculture. That's usually a sticking point in trade talks.
Definitely. American farmers faced hurdles selling things like almonds, apples, poultry in India. High tariffs, complicated import rules. That hits a key U.S. sector. So these specific examples, bites, tech, agriculture, were constantly brought up as proof of India's supposedly restrictive practices, fueling the demand for India to lower its barriers.
Okay, fast forward to now, 2024. We're hearing similar themes on the campaign trail again. But this reciprocal tariffs threat, it feels maybe even sharper this time, more aggressive.
It certainly does. The idea of reciprocal tariffs is back with real emphasis in recent campaign rhetoric. The basic concept is simple enough. If country X puts a tariff on U.S. goods, the U.S. hits country X's goods with an equivalent tariff. Tit for tat.
Like a mirror image.
Kind of, but the way it's being talked about now seems to go beyond just simple mirroring.
Right, because the specific threat isn't just we'll match you, it's even more aggressively. What does that actually imply? What could that escalation look like?
Exactly. That phrase, even more aggressively, is key. It suggests the response wouldn't just be equal, but potentially much harsher. It could mean imposing tariffs at, say, double the rate India imposes, or maybe applying tariffs to a much wider range of Indian goods than just the ones India targeted.
So more punitive than reciprocal.
That seems to be the implication, almost designed to inflict maximum economic pain to force a quick change in India's policy. For example, if India puts a high tariff on U.S. almonds, an aggressive response might slap huge tariffs on, say, Indian textiles or pharmaceuticals, major exports not just mirroring the almond tariff.
Aiming for maximum leverage.
That appears to be the goal, to create what's termed fair trade by using significant economic pressure as the primary tool.
And there was that quote from the campaign trail that really laid this out, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Very starkly.
Yes, very directly stated at a rally. If India slaps us with 100% tariffs, we'll hit them right back. Maybe double that. Fair trade is not a one-way street.
Any double that. That's
Yeah.
not quite a statement.
It really is. It's not subtle. It's a public declaration of intent, signaling a willingness to use disproportionate economic force. The message seems to be, a future administration led this way won't tolerate perceived protectionism from others and is ready to, well, re-engineer trade relationships using significant leverage. It signals uncompromising resolve.
Now, it's always tempting with campaign talk to just brush it off. Oh, they won't really do that. But what does a deeper look suggest here? Is it just about winning votes, or is there a more sustained intent?
That's the crucial question. And yes, of course, it's partly campaign strategy. It's designed to appeal to voters worried about trade, about manufacturing jobs. That's undeniable. However, just dismissing it as only rhetoric would likely be a mistake. It clearly reflects a consistent ideological commitment to protectionist policies. It's a theme that's been there for years.
A core belief, maybe?
It seems that way. And the implications of that consistency are pretty huge. If that approach returns to the White House, these policies could genuinely reshape global trade. We could see broader tariff hikes, not just with India, maybe sparking wider trade disputes, a more volatile global environment.
Less predictability.
Definitely. Likely a push to renegotiate existing trade deals, both multilateral and bilateral, aiming for terms seen as better for the U.S., often through a very transactional lens. It could mean a further shift away from established bodies like the World Trade Organization towards more direct bilateral, and sometimes confrontational approaches.
Using economic leverage almost like a foreign policy weapon.
Exactly. Where economic policy and foreign policy become almost blurred, trade becomes a key battleground in geopolitical competition.
That's a really critical framing.
Yeah.
Because it moves this way beyond just an economic spat. It has potentially huge geopolitical ripples. Which brings us to this interesting paradox, doesn't it? Because India, as you mentioned, isn't just any trade partner. There's this massive strategic catch to all this tough trade talk.
That is the paradox, precisely. India is not just another country on the trade deficit list. This is where the specific economic complaints collide head-on with much bigger strategic realities. It makes this whole situation far more complex than just arguing over tariff levels. India's importance goes way beyond the balance sheets. It's deeply tied into global security, into strategic competition.
Okay, let's unpack that strategic side more. Why is India seen as such a vital geopolitical player? What's its unique role, especially in that crucial Indo-Pacific region?
India's role in the Indo-Pacific is absolutely central, almost indispensable, you could argue. This whole region, stretching from Africa's east coast all the way across to the Pacific, has become the main stage for 21st century global competition, economically, strategically.
Largely because of China's rise.
Primarily, yes. China's rapid military buildup, its growing economic influence, it challenges the existing international order in that region. And India, well, it sits right at the heart of it. Huge population now. The world's largest, a growing economy, a critical location. It's widely viewed as a crucial counterweight to China's influence, a democratic counterweight, importantly.
And its role in the QA alliance speaks to that.
Absolutely. The QA, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, brings together the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. Officially, it's about promoting a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific shared values like democracy. But in practice, everyone understands it's a key grouping for coordinating efforts to balance China's growing power in Asia. It's not a formal military alliance like NATO, but it's strategically vital.
And India's active participation is key to its effectiveness.
Undeniably. It underscores India's importance to U.S. strategy there. Plus, India is consistently called a rising power. It's on track to be one of the world's biggest economies, a major independent force. Its young population, growing middle class, tech capabilities, its influence is only set to grow. Its size and potential make it a power center in its own right.
And there was a foreign policy analyst quoted making a very direct connection between putting economic pressure on India and potentially weakening the U.S. strategic position.
Yeah.
What was that specific warning?
Yes, that analyst warned quite explicitly. Pushing India away economically could weaken the U.S. strategic position in the Indo-Pacific. It really highlights the delicate balancing act the U.S. faces. On one side, you have domestic pressure to fix trade imbalances, to look tough on trade.
The economic argument.
Right. But on the other side, you have the absolute strategic need to strengthen alliances in a region vital to global stability and U.S. security. And India is a cornerstone of that strategy. It's a democratic partner in a region facing growing authoritarianism, a key collaborator in maintaining a balance of power.
So escalating economic disputes could really strain that partnership.
Significantly. It could make India less willing, maybe less able, to align closely with U.S. strategic goals there. That weakening could show up in different ways, maybe less enthusiasm for joint security work, maybe reduced intelligence sharing on key threats like terrorism or maritime security, or just a general cooling of relations that makes cooperation harder.
And that could inadvertently create openings for rivals?
Potentially, yes. It could undermine years of diplomatic work and U.S. goals in arguably the most strategically important region in the world right now. It's a gamble with potentially very high geopolitical stakes.
So alongside these trade disputes, there's also this undeniable economic interdependence that we really need to factor in. India isn't just a competitor. It's also a crucial partner for the U.S. in some very specific, very important sectors.
That's a fundamentally important point, and yeah, it often gets lost when the focus is just on tariffs and deficits. While those disputes exist, India is also a vital economic partner. Its role in global supply chains is increasingly critical, affecting American businesses and, frankly, everyday American lives.
And we're talking about really essential things here, right? Things that directly impact health, access to goods. Can you give us a better sense of that interdependence, especially pharmaceuticals?
Absolutely. Pharmaceuticals is a huge one. India is often called the pharmacy of the world. It's a massive supplier of affordable generic drugs to the United States.
Generics being the cheaper versions of brand name drugs once patents expire.
Exactly. And this isn't just a small contribution. Some estimates suggest as much as 40% of generic drugs taken in the U.S. are either made in India or rely on key ingredients, APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients sourced from India.
40%, that's enormous.
It is. These generics are absolutely vital for keeping healthcare affordable for millions of Americans. So imagine disrupting that supply chain with big tariffs or a trade war. It could very quickly lead to significant price hikes for U.S. consumers, maybe even shortages of essential medicines for everything from blood pressure to infections.
So the reliance is deep, foundational, really.
Very much so. And it's not just pharma. Think about software services. India is a global leader there. U.S. companies, big and small, rely heavily on Indian IT services, software development, data analytics, customer support, all sorts of things.
Outsourcing, basically.
Yes, leveraging India's skilled workforce for cost-effective, high-quality tech solutions. It's deeply embedded in how many American businesses operate. And then you have textile, another major import category from India. Clothes, home furnishings, impacting retail prices across the board. These examples just underscore how interconnected the two economies really are, far beyond just the trade deficit number.
Okay, so that sets up this really sharp tension, doesn't it? The U.S. wants to correct the trade balance with India, maybe protect some domestic industries, but at the same time, it relies incredibly heavily on India for critical things like affordable medicines. Does that mean a tariff war could actually backfire? Become self-damaging for the U.S.?
That is precisely the core tension. It's incredibly complex. You have this political push to address trade deficits, perceived unfairness, protect U.S. jobs. That's one side. But on the other side, you have this undeniable, almost inescapable dependence on India for things that are essential for U.S. industries and consumers.
So walk us through the potential ripple effect. If tariffs go up on Indian pharma imports, what happens next?
Okay, so if tariffs are slapped on Indian pharmaceuticals, maybe some U.S.-based drug manufacturers benefit slightly in the short term, maybe. But the much bigger immediate impact is likely felt by millions of American consumers. They could face higher prices for their generic prescriptions, maybe even struggle to get certain drugs if supply chains are disrupted.
So the cost of healthcare goes up.
Potentially, yes. Similarly, if tariffs hit those Indian software services, U.S. tech firms could face higher operating costs, project delays, maybe struggle to find alternative suppliers quickly.
Which could mean higher prices for their software or services too.
Exactly. So a tariff war, while maybe intended to protect U.S. interests or force India's hand, could boomerang. It could lead to higher costs for American businesses, major supply chain headaches, and reduced access or higher prices for essential goods and services for American consumers.
It really highlights how tangled modern supply chains are.
Absolutely. Interdependence often outweighs simple ideas about trade balance. Protectionism aimed at solving one problem can easily create several new ones downstream, especially in today's global economy.
Which leads us right into the wider potential consequences, the ripple effects of a full-blown trade war. Because it's not just about India or specific U.S. industries, it's about the potential economic backlash right here in the U.S.
That's exactly right. A tariff war, even if the intention is to protect U.S. interests, could significantly and maybe unintentionally harm American businesses and consumers. The simple appeal of protectionism often glosses over these complex downstream costs and unintended consequences for the domestic economy itself. Sometimes those costs can outweigh any perceived benefit.
So let's trace that chain reaction more clearly.
Yeah.
How do higher tariffs on Indian goods actually turn into rising costs for American businesses? Give us some concrete examples.
Sure, let's break it down. When the U.S. imposes higher tariffs on, say, Indian textiles, an American clothing company that imports those textiles immediately faces a higher cost to bring them into the country.
Their raw material cost goes up.
Instantly. Same for a U.S. company importing those generic drug ingredients from India. If there's a 25% tariff, their input cost jumps 25%. Or the tech firm using Indian IT services' new levies mean higher project costs. Now, these businesses facing higher costs have a choice. They can either absorb those costs,
which eats into profits, maybe affects hiring or investment.
Right. Or the more likely option, especially over time, is they pass those costs along.
And along to the consumer.
Exactly. Which means those rising business costs almost inevitably lead to higher prices for American consumers. It's a classic pass-through effect.
So the pharmaceutical company paying more for Indian ingredients.
That translates directly to higher prices for your prescription at the pharmacy. The cost of that generic blood pressure pill might go up.
The clothing brand paying more for Indian textiles.
The price tag on that shirt or those jeans at the mall goes up. It hits everyday items, home goods. So the financial burden doesn't just stay with the importing companies. It ultimately lands on American households. It acts like a hidden tax, reducing purchasing power.
Which could potentially slow down the whole economy if people spend less.
It certainly could. So while the tariffs target foreign goods, the actual economic pain is often felt most acutely by domestic consumers. It makes the cost of living higher.
Okay, shifting from the purely economic back to the geopolitical side, there's this profound risk too, isn't there? Pushing away a crucial ally like India that could have really negative consequences for the U.S. globally. It feels like risking long-term strategy for short-term economic goals.
It really does raise that fundamental question. When you're dealing with a major strategic partner, is pursuing fair trade through very aggressive tactics worth the potential damage to the broader alliance and geopolitical stability? It's a huge dilemma. Because yes, putting that kind of economic pressure on India could absolutely have significant negative geopolitical fallout for the U.S. It could potentially undermine years of careful diplomatic work.
And that foreign policy analyst we mentioned was very blunt about this. Remind us of their specific warning about the U.S. strategic position.
Yes, their warning was stark. Pushing India away economically could weaken the U.S. strategic position in the Indo-Pacific. That's not just a mild concern, it's a serious warning. Think about it in the context of China's rise. Strengthening alliances in the Indo-Pacific is a top U.S. priority. And India is absolutely central to that, a democratic counterweight, a partner in maintaining stability.
So if economic fights poison the well,
It could make India less willing or maybe less able to align closely with U.S. strategy. Maybe they become more hesitant about joint military exercises, less forthcoming with intelligence sharing on regional threats.
a cooling of the relationship.
Exactly, a less enthusiastic partnership. And that potentially creates vulnerabilities, maybe openings that China could exploit. It could diminish U.S. influence in a critical region.
This really gets to the heart of the alliance question. We often hear the U.S. and India described as natural allies, shared democracy, converging interests. How specifically could a prolonged trade fight damage that partnership, which seems to have been growing stronger?
That term natural allies is pretty fitting based on shared democratic values, commitment to a rules-based order, mutual interest in a stable Indo-Pacific. The partnership has grown significantly deeper defense ties, counterterrorism work, strategic dialogues, people-to-people links. But yeah, long-term trade friction can be like acid, corroding that foundation. If one ally feels the other is acting unfairly against its economic interests, especially as using punitive tariffs, that breeds resentment. It erodes trust.
Even if the overall strategic goals align.
Even then, if India feels unduly pressured by the U.S. on trade issues it sees as vital for its own development, it might lead them to rethink the relationship. Not necessarily break ties, that seems unlikely given the bigger picture, but it could definitely lead to a more cautious, less enthusiastic partnership. Maybe India becomes more hesitant on joint initiatives, maybe looks harder at diversifying its own defense and economic ties away from just the U.S.
More emphasis on self-reliance, maybe. Or looking elsewhere.
Potentially. It could undermine that carefully built mutual respect and shared vision. Aggressive economic disputes can do real damage to the broader strategic relationship.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even a bit alarming. This raises that provocative question from the source material. Could this kind of U.S. pressure actually risk pushing India closer to other powers, specifically maybe Russia or even China?
This is probably the biggest long-term geopolitical worry, the one that keeps strategists up at night. India has always prized its strategic autonomy, its tradition of non-alignment. It tries to balance relationships to maximize its own interests, avoid overdependence on any one bloc.
But it still needs reliable partners, right, for its economy, defense.
Absolutely. And historically, India has had very deep ties with Russia, especially for defense equipment. Russia is still India's biggest arms supplier, a legacy from the Cold War. So if the U.S. becomes seen as an unreliable or hostile economic partner because of trade fights, could India feel compelled to deepen that existing defense link with Russia? It's a possibility.
And China.
Yeah.
That seems counterintuitive given their rivals.
It does, because they absolutely are geopolitical rivals. Border disputes, regional competition. It's tense. But China is also India's largest trading partner. There's a huge amount of economic interaction despite the rivalry.
So economic necessity could play a role.
It's conceivable. If the relationship with the U.S. becomes too difficult or punitive, India might perhaps reluctantly, feel it needs to expand trade ties with China, or maybe align with China on certain global issues, purely out of economic pragmatism or as a way to balance U.S. pressure.
And the implications of that kind of shift
Yet
for U.S. influence, for security in Asia.
profoundly negative for the U.S. It would seriously complicate efforts to balance China's influence and maintain that free and open Indo-Pacific. A more alienated India could mean a weaker, more fragmented QA alliance. Less cooperation on critical maritime security. It could give China more room to maneuver. It might just lead to a more complex, maybe less stable, multipolar security situation in Asia where U.S. influence is reduced and its goals are harder to achieve. Even a partial shift would be a significant setback.
Which brings us to thinking about the path forward, navigating future relations. Because it feels like the chance of renewed friction, particularly if there's a change in the U.S. administration after 2025, is, well, it seems pretty high, almost unavoidable.
It really does seem highly likely. The core idea is if an administration with that protectionist focus returns, reviving and probably intensifying hardline trade talks with India isn't just speculation. It's based on consistent past behavior and stated intentions. The past seems like a clear indicator here.
Now, we should be fair. India hasn't just stonewalled on every issue, right? The source mentioned India has shown some willingness to resolve certain disputes. Can you give examples of that?
Yes, that's important context. India has been pragmatic at times, showing it's willing to find solutions, especially when it sees mutual benefit or wants to avoid bigger trade fights. A good example is digital taxes. India, like other countries, put a tax on foreign digital companies, mainly big U.S. tech firms. The U.S. called it discriminatory, threatened tariffs.
I remember that.
But India engaged in multilateral talks through the OECD, trying to find a global agreement on digital taxes. That showed a preference for negotiation over just digging in its heels. Similarly, on certain market access issues, maybe for specific U.S. farm products or medical devices, there have been times when India has explored reducing barriers, often as part of a wider trade discussion or diplomatic package.
So not completely inflexible.
No, definitely not. It shows strategic flexibility, trying to balance its interests while keeping lines open, especially with a major partner like the U.S.
But then you run into that potential clash of styles we talked about. India is often more measured, gradual negotiation versus a more aggressive, demand-heavy, transactional U.S. approach. How could that difference itself create new friction, even if India is trying to resolve things?
That clash of styles is a really crucial dynamic, yeah. It's a potential source of major friction. India's diplomacy often involves slow consensus building, seeking gradual change through dialogue, respecting international norms. It's about the long game relationship building. The other style, the more aggressive one, demands quick, big concessions. It uses tariffs openly as leverage. It's public, often confrontational, focused on winning the deal now.
Very different philosophies.
Fundamentally different. And that divergence means even if India shows genuine willingness on some issues, the U.S. side might demand faster, broader changes than India is willing or domestically able to deliver.
Leading to frustration on both sides.
Exactly. It could lead to stalemate, accusations of bad faith, claims of slow progress, even if India is engaging. That difference in approach could easily make the relationship a lot bumpier, as the source put it, turning manageable disagreements into major sticking points. It makes finding common ground much harder.
So it really comes down to this bigger picture question. Deals versus diplomacy. Will the aggressive pressure actually get the U.S. better deals on trade, or does it risk poisoning the well with a key strategic partner where the alliance itself is maybe far more valuable than specific tariff levels?
That is the absolute core tension, the fundamental question here. The stated goal of the aggressive approach is always better deals, more favorable terms, reduced deficits, more market access for U.S. goods. But the huge dilemma is whether chasing those economic wins using coercive tactics ends up undermining the much broader, arguably more critical strategic relationship with India.
Because, as we've said, they're natural allies on so many other fronts.
Precisely. Shared values, converging interests against common rivals, cooperation on global issues. But trade remains this persistent sore spot. The real gamble is whether pushing too hard on that sore spot using these aggressive tactics damages the whole alliance fabric. Could the U.S. end up losing more strategic ground in the Indo-Pacific than it gains economically? It really tests whether you can separate economic policy from foreign policy or if they have to work together.
And with the renewed threat of higher tariffs back on the table, that warning from the source that the next phase might get a lot bumpier, it really lands, doesn't it? Feels more like a forecast of turbulence than smooth sailing.
It absolutely does. It feels like a heads up for increased volatility. While the U.S. India relationship always has trade issues, remember the GSP withdrawal, the overall trend recently has been towards deeper strategic partnership. But reintroducing this really aggressive trade rhetoric, explicitly threatening to be even more aggressive, signals a potential shift, a move towards a more confrontational, less cooperative dynamic. This bumpier road could mean more public fights over trade, new tariffs going up, maybe less trust between the governments. It would force both countries into a constant, tricky balancing act, managing economic friction without wrecking the vital strategic alignment. It's going to require a lot of careful diplomacy on both sides.
Okay, this has been incredibly helpful in untangling a really complex and, frankly, evolving situation. Let's just quickly recap the main points for you, our listeners, so it's all clear. We started with Donald Trump's consistent protectionist stance, noting his current threats towards India aren't new, but echo past actions like removing India's GSP benefits. Big impact there.
hmm Then we really dug into India's crucial dual role. Yes, a trade partner with a deficit issue for the U.S., but far more importantly, a vital strategic ally. A rising power, key QAD member, essential for balancing China in the Indo-Pacific.
Right. And finally, we looked hard at the potential fallout from escalating trade tensions. The real risk of higher costs hitting American consumers and businesses, think pharmaceuticals, textiles, tech services.
And critically, the geopolitical danger. The risk of alienating India, potentially pushing this crucial democratic partner closer to rivals like Russia or China, which could seriously weaken the U.S. strategic position in Asia. It's all deeply interconnected.
So when you connect all these dots, you see these aren't just isolated events. They impact global stability, they affect supply chains, and like we said, they can hit your wallet, the cost of medicines, everyday goods. Understanding this stuff is key to grasping bigger global currents.
Absolutely. It shows how decisions made seemingly about trade can have these huge ripple effects on geopolitics, alliances, and even daily life.
So what does this all mean for you? It means understanding these dynamics isn't just for the policy wonks. It impacts the price of things you buy, the stability of a critical region, the strength of alliances that affect global security. It's a reminder that trade disputes can reshape the world in unexpected ways. Which leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder, building on everything we've discussed. When dealing with complex international relations, especially with strategically vital partners like India, is aggressively pursuing perceived fair trade worth the potential risk to those broader alliances and long-term stability? Or, in our incredibly interconnected world today, is patient, nuanced strategic diplomacy, thinking about the long game, ultimately the smarter approach? Something to think about.